Heliocentrism was a model of the universe first formally introduced into the astronomical zeitgeist by Renaissance astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus in the 16th century, revolutionary in its willingness to ask the once forbidden question: what if the sun had a face and looked mildly constipated at all times? However, while Copernicus tends to get all the credit for making the world based and sun-pilled, the idea was by no means unexplored before the development of his model. As early as the 5th century BC, the concept of the Earth being a sphere that rotated around a central divine fire was put forth by Greek philosopher Philolaus, later expanded on in the 3rd century BC by Aristarchus of Samos. Pay attention, this will be on the test. And it's in that temporal gap between Aristarchus and Copernicus that we find the subject of today's video. A deeply fascinating series that posits the question, what if this scholarly lineage included a bunch of very, very unfortunate Polish people? About the movement of the Earth by Woto, or to use its official English title, Orb, on the movements of the Earth? Like, shit dude, sure is a historical fiction manga detailing the century-long lead-up to the Copernican Revolution. A century wherein those researching ideas that conflicted with the word of the Catholic Church faced ceaseless pursuit, torture, and even brutal execution. Asterisk. Because from what little research I've done, there isn't really much out there detailing the persecution of heliocentrists pre-16th century. Now this research was pretty surface level and it's the Catholic Church, so it's probably at least partially true, but the presence of a Polish duelist cutting down an entire platoon with a single swipe of his blade gives me the impression there's a bit of artistic liberty being taken with the setting, so I'll probably look to more reliable sources for information on Polish culture. It's a series with its fair share of rough edges, but none severe enough to make it anything less than enthralling almost all the way through. Provided you don't mind it when manga gets a bit wordy. Not Togashi level, but this series is undoubtedly centered on nerd-ass shit and it is not afraid of reminding you. Also, while we're doing disclaimers, there's 2 more I should go over before we begin. Firstly, this manga contains some kinda graphic scenes of torture, which might surprise you given the roughness of some of the art, but rest assured it can get real visceral when it wants to. That said, I don't personally find it excessive, and it's usually made very obvious when it's about to happen so you can skip ahead a page or two, except in the first chapter where it just kinda jump scares you with it real early. So if nail pulling, teeth pulling, or the pair of anguish sound like things that would make you uncomfortable, be warned. Second, the translation I was reading that was obtained through completely legitimate channels was a bit shaky and inconsistent in places, particularly when it came to names. So if I pronounce a name differently than how it's written in a panel I'm showing, it's because I just picked whichever one sounded the most correct. That or it's Polish.
Potocki.
But you know what doesn't sound correct? This shit, and I'm gonna learn you why. Poland in the early 1400s. The Catholic Church rests on a firm but waning seat of influence. Children play in the streets, heretics burn at the stake, and in a small classroom of about 20-odd students, Father Potocki is commending the smarmiest little shit you've ever seen for his acceptance into university. This is our protagonist Rafal, and while his light Yagami-ass internal monologue doesn't make the best first impression, unless you're a particularly annoying type of person, it becomes very clear very quickly that he's less a sociopathic narcissist and more just a smart kid trying to make the most of what he's got. A kid who, while fancying himself a real Randian intellectual type, can't help but feel discouraged when told to stop his nightly star cataloging. But regardless of how he feels, Rafal has no intention of rocking the boat and putting his future at risk. And so, complying with his father's wishes, he agrees to stop and goes to pick up his old acquaintance Hubert from the city guard. Surely his ominous appearance and history of forbidden research do not foreshadow anything resembling an inciting incident. See, this is why you don't study the stars, because violent space wizards will forcibly recruit you into their heretical research in opposition to the church. That's why I chart my paths exclusively through a combination of coin flips and prophetic dreams. But even dragged back in against his will, Rafal can't help but marvel at the unparalleled beauty of an open starry sky, an awe born of the same insatiable curiosity that drove Hubert in his studies. And so he deigns to reveal to him his ideas for a new model of the universe, one that plucks the Earth from its center and places it as a speck in the orbit of the sun. A bizarre, outlandish, and heretical thesis that puts his life at risk for merely considering it, but one that would right the apparent chaos of the planets above, one that would make this universe beautiful. Unfortunately, while this revelation lights a fire within Rafal, the church catches wind of their solar sacrilege, and lights a much larger one under Hubert who, knowing his work will be carried on, sacrifices himself covering for Rafal. And so, even given the opportunity to cut ties and walk away from the whole thing, Rafal goes against his better judgment and takes up Hubert's mantle as the next herald of the Earth Movement theory. And this point here is what really cements Rafal as more than just a light Yagami type. As while he does put together a multi-decade-long Machiavellian scheme to research and disseminate the theory and change the world, he is 1. Driven and inspired primarily by others and the cause greater than himself, and 2. Caught almost immediately because he is still a kid and got careless. And here we get into spoilers for one of the most major aspects of the series. The kind I normally wouldn't even cover, but in this case it comes so early and is so central to the structure of the story that I can't really discuss the rest of the series without it. So if you care about spoilers, now's where you pause until you've read at least the first 4 chapters. We good? Alright, back to the child on trial for space crimes. Caught red-handed, but on his first offense, Inquisitor Novak informs Rafal he has an easy out. Renounce astronomy and tell him where he's kept his research materials so they can be burned. And while he wouldn't have an amazing life to look forward to, given he'd be forbidden from his greatest passion and likely ostracized by his peers, he would retain the ability to eat solid food. But as he wallows in frustration, contemplating how he could have taken such pointless risks over something so meaningless, he is met by the light of the moon spilling through a small window in his cell. A light that, even through cages both physical and spiritual, imparts upon him a realization. This idea, the story, it's too important to die here. It must continue, whether or not he gets to be its hero. Because regardless of how tightly the powers that be may cling to the status quo, the seasons will shift, the people will change, and the Earth will move. This last resolution, while it costs him his life, also grants him the will to wrest control from the Church, both from their dogma and scheduled execution, as he looks a hardened Inquisitor in the eye with a smile on his face and informs him that he had, in fact, garnished his final drink with a substance that will kill him painlessly long before they can drag him to the dungeons. Passing on content as his would-be tormentor, a man with sleeves stained perpetually red is shaken pale. Light wishes he was this baller. Maybe that's why they put Orb in the title. So yeah, this manga's a bit different. Goes hard in the paint, one might say. It doesn't subscribe to the Dr. Stone school of fictional research, where one intellectual ubermensch manifests multiple breakthroughs via the girth of his mental meat. Scientific research is a long, slow, perpetually ongoing process, wherein every major discovery is built on the foundation of centuries of work done by those that came before. And so, 10 years after Rafal's last stand, he passes on the torch as Hubert once did for him. And you'd best believe these chucklefucks aren't the anchor of this relay either. That's not to say they're not interesting though. It takes a real specific kind of weirdo to willingly put yourself at risk of being strung up on the holy barbecue for a theory whose validation bears little actual benefit for the vast majority of people. But the thing about highly repressive social structures is that they are a pressure cooker for freaks, as demonstrated by our main cast. And I don't mean freak in the wacky anime character sense, because certain scenes notwithstanding, all the characters we encounter feel like real people from the time period grappling with difficult circumstances. I mean, some of their designs can look kinda stupid, but in a way that still comes across as grounded and flawed. Nobody looks or acts like a hero or protagonist because no one really is. Most of them hold God and their faith in high regard, even as they actively work on materials that the church would kill them for, because religion is still a very prominent fixture of day-to-day life. And consequently, most of the quirks they develop are a result of them trying to reconcile that faith with the inconsistencies they find and the crushing existential dread of being a Polish peasant. And it's this crucible of internal and external conflicts the characters go through that forms the core of this manga. Because in spite of how important the Earth movement theory is to the characters, this is not a series about astronomy. It's about faith, purpose, legacy, and the perpetually changing nature of the world for good and bad, with the theory almost acting like a plot device at points. You know, just in case it wasn't heady enough for you. Over the course of the story, we follow a pair of duelists, 2 shockingly intelligent young girls, an order of primitivist knights, and a Catholic big boss. Not necessarily in that order. All of whom, in spite of the outlandishness of their lives, demonstrate the different ways in which people avoid, confront, and process these existential crises. Ranging from finding meaning in the beauty of the world in spite of the suffering and inherent meaninglessness they perceive, or taking that beauty as evidence that reinforces their faith. And probably the best example of this is Aki. Aki is a duelist and member of a security guild, working on behalf of clients that include, among others, the church. Through witnessing the cruel realities of his line of work, as well as a childhood that instilled within him a powerful sense of nihilism and religious guilt, Aki grew to be a thoroughly miserable, subservient man, whose hopelessness in the world around him was surpassed only by a self-loathing so powerful he can't even gaze at the sky without feeling like the heavens themselves look down on him with contempt. The only hope he has for the future is eventually dying and crossing his fingers he saved up enough Catholic points to go to heaven. A goal that is complicated somewhat when he is hired to escort a heretic to his execution. 3 guesses what he's in for. And making good on his warlock-ass character design, the heretic enlightens Oki and his partner with forbidden knowledge on the unmatched power of the sun, marking him as the one to inherit Rafal's work in his stead. That's what you get for not taking Eldritch Blast, you contrarian jackass. The odyssey that then ensues sees Aki branded a heretic, his only friend dying in front of him as he entrusts him with a mission he wants no part in with his final words, and his only remaining hope being a stuck-up clergyman that seems to think as little of him as he thinks of himself. But it's here, cut off from the only things that ever gave him any sense of security or familiarity, that Aki is finally forced to confront himself and become a person. He makes friends, stands up for himself, starts learning how to read, decides he wants to go to university. And this growth is vital in the development of the actual theory, letting him use the incredible eyesight that makes him such a good swordsman to observe the stars. Looking beyond his own self-loathing and finally realizing the world is beautiful in its own right, no less a celestial body than the sun and the stars. The effects of this change then ripple out to the people around him, inspiring others to take interest in the theory and, in the clergyman's case, learning the value of collaborating with others. That is, when he's not talking about how the increasing accessibility to literacy would result in the creation and spread of massive amounts of nonsensical information that would eventually become impossible to parse. Altogether, he finds enough meaning in this life that he's willing to brave the risk of being sent to hell for opposing the church, because no torture performed by human hands could hold a candle to the anguish of having to accept the world as it is. And then also he pulls out the fucking Zandatsu and a bunch of Inquisitors at one point, but that's not really as thematically relevant. Unless you want to keep the Metal Gear comparisons going. And even when their plans fall apart, it's this newfound growth and drive that allows the theory to be carried on. Larger than any one person, but lost to the ether without every individual effort and sacrifice made in its name. And it does carry on the fringes of society until the world is ready for it, through revolutionaries and heretics and proto-capitalists and a bunch of paladins that took druid levels. Or maybe wizard levels. None of which come across nearly as absurd and out of place as they sound on paper. Or maybe I've just been placated by the funny Unabomber knights blowing up barrels of gunpowder. Either way, it's very engaging. Of course, that's not to say I don't have my issues with it. The first and most obvious being the art, which, while I do believe works for the story being told, comes across kinda lacking in ways that end up hurting it. The action scenes can occasionally be awkward and difficult to follow, and random panels come off looking legitimately hilarious in ways I don't think were intentional. Unless Badeni is supposed to be Archon, and I just completely misread the author's intentions. Beyond that, from a writing standpoint, while I really like how most of it is done and don't mind the wordiness for the most part, it can get really out of hand at points. Not necessarily in volume, but more so the context being harder and harder to suspend disbelief for. By which I mean some of these Polish villagers really have no reason to be this verbose and well-read, and in some cases, prophetic? Like, one of the later characters we follow is a Romani girl named Draka, whose whole deal is how obsessed she is with getting the bag. She is so dedicated to money maxing that even in the absence of formal education, she is spontaneously able to conceive the system of capitalism and insist they institute it in their nomadic community. Fortunately, her uncle is apparently Karl fucking Marx and immediately lays out the inevitable disastrous consequences of an economic system that prioritizes wealth accumulation over the welfare of the people. And look, I'm not European, alright? I'm not saying Romani people can't be intelligent. But there's Copernicus and then there's Nostradamus, you feel me? And even with characters where that kind of monologuing makes more sense, it gets to the point where all the philosophizing starts feeling kinda self-indulgent. Like, it's all still interesting, but they can go on for a while, and I can't help but feel there must have been a better way to explore— Oh, son of a bitch, it's Metal Gear again! And while I'd like to say that's my biggest problem with the writing, that honor is unfortunately gonna have to go to something a lot more significant. The ending. Which honestly ends up feeling really rushed and undercooked. To be clear, it's not nearly bad enough to invalidate what the rest of the series does as well, at least for me, since, as I said, the focus is largely on broader themes and individual character arcs, most of which get satisfying resolutions before the final ending. But still, it's a pretty deflating note to end on. All that said, this wouldn't be my longest script to date if I didn't think the series was still worth experiencing. Just the uniqueness of the premise and having the balls to kill off its apparent protagonist 4 chapters in would probably have been enough on their own for me to at least mention it in a video at some point. As a whole, rough edges and all, it's a declaration of humanity's ability to move forward, both technologically and spiritually. Regardless of the suffering inherent to sapience, void of any apparent purpose, Orb testifies to the light that can be brought into one's life by everything from the majesty of the vast universe we inhabit, to personal spirituality separate from dogma, to our connections to other people, both present and long past. It gazes into the abyss and finds every inch of it saturated with cosmic beauty, and then tells us that we can do the same. That what good the world holds is potent enough to let us weather the bad. That for better or worse, the seasons will shift. the people will change, and the Earth